Hello everyone. Every now and again, parishioners come up to me and ask me the occasional question. And a few days ago, I got an email from a parishioner asking a question about a rather throwaway comment that I made during this past Sunday's liturgy. And it had to do with the relationship between sin and sickness and death. And I randomly threw out the statement that sickness and death are a result of sin entering into the world. And so the parishioner asked the question, like, well, can you explain that? What's the deal with that? And I had an intuition that more than a few have had this question, as I have had it a lot for myself. And not only that, but by posing that question, then many other questions start to crop up. And so this would begin what I'd like to call a vision of the faith from the peripheries, or peripheral vision. This view of our Christian faith from a brand new angle, or one in which we might not have considered, because there are many different ways in which we can approach the gospel, and many people have their own different starting places. And there are some questions that many people would not be bothered to even ask, and there's some questions that will bother people to the end of their lives. Now, these are the peripheral questions. Why is this important? Well, the question of why sickness and death are a result of sin have to do with the very nature of creation as such. God created the world good. Now, of course, there leads then to the next question is, how does one then handle the experience of those things that are clearly not good, i.e. sickness and death? Now, there are many ways in which human beings have tried to answer the question of the coexistence of good and bad experiences in the world. One goes in one tack is to say all things are good, but only good as seen from a particular perspective. This is often connected with pantheism and certain types of meditation. But the Judeo-Christian tradition kind of goes, nah, I don't buy it. Because even though good can be drawn out of these things, the experience of them being unnatural or tragic and almost wrong. Any one of us who's been sick, or anyone who's experienced the feeling of mourning or felt the looming of their own mortality, it strangely feels unnatural. And so with that, then we have this feeling like it was never part of the plan to begin with. And so the Christian tradition, inheriting from the Jewish one, actually has from the Book of Wisdom where God says, God did not create death, nor does he rejoice in the death of the living, but rather it was through the devil's envy that death entered the world. Now, sickness is not as fundamental as death. In a sense, it is like a sacramental of death. Now, by sacramental, I don't mean a good thing, but it's a sign or something that participates in the reality. Just as holy water participates in the reality of baptism, so sickness then has this foretasting or foreshadowing or pointing towards what death is. Now, the more also we reflect on the nature of our conscience, we can also see that many illnesses and diseases actually have an analogy to evil, moral evil. Cancer, for instance, is a strange part of the body where cells refuse to die and go on living almost unnaturally. I don't quite know the science of it, but the disease of cancer is when a part of the body grows to excess and beyond its proper proportion. And because it does not limit itself, then it starts becoming parasitic to the actual functioning of the body. A virus is very similar, but different. It is a protein wrapped in a fat, and then that thing, when it gets inside a cell or a part of the human body, rewires it and twists it, just as sin rewires and twists us. Now, another symbol in which sickness and death are likened to sin is that while they kill the host, they can't live beyond it. One of my favorite comedians, Norm Macdonald, had a joke about disease, in that we often describe disease as someone fighting a battle with diseases and losing. But he pointed out that it's always at least a draw, because the moment that the cancer beats you, it loses. And that also is analogous to sin as well, because it doesn't lead to life. It is always self-defeating, which is one of the reasons why the Christian is always called not to turn away from evil. It's not simply because God forbids it, but because it does lead to death. It does lead to the end of us. Now, what's also important, though, is that throughout John's Gospel, Jesus does make a distinction between different kinds of death. You see this in the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, where he says, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, and the disciples go, well, I guess he's okay then. And Jesus is like, no. He's dead, but I'm going to raise him up. And so, from the perspective of how the story is being told, the nature of death does kind of shift. It's either a mortal death, or it's an eternal death. In fact, in the book of Revelation, it's described as the second death. It's when, weirdly enough, death becomes terminal. So because God created us to be good and to live for life, then we can understand then that anything that works in cross purposes to that is a servant of evil. But, and this is where it gets particularly complicated in the Old Testament tradition, just because a person suffers from a sickness does not mean that they have sinned. The existence of sin is symptomatic of something wrong in creation. But it doesn't mean that because a person is suffering, that therefore they have sinned, or because of an absence of sin, that they are somehow perfect. You can see how sometimes in the ancient world this problem will come up, especially among people like the Greeks, who always supposed that there was a connection between virtue and personal physical beauty. Well, that person's beautiful, they obviously must be of good character. Now there's a bit to that. They had this understanding that nature is a cohesive whole, and so to be externally beautiful must be a sign of internal beauty. But the Jewish people knew better than that. They knew from their reflections on the law and their own history that it doesn't quite work out so simply. Now, one of the most beautiful books that describes this understanding is the book of Job. Job is the just man who suffers greatly at the hands of a wager between God and the devil, or Satan as he is in the story. Now, Satan is known as the accuser, and he wants to show God how filthy humanity really is. And God says, hey, well, Job's a good guy. And Satan goes, yeah, but he's hiding something. Not only is he hiding something, he only loves you because you've been good to him. Take that stuff away, and you'll know where he really lies. Well, God says, all right, let's find out then. Now, throughout the book, Job suffers tremendously with great sufferings, pains, and tragedies in his life. And even when he is tempted by his family, by his neighbors, to repudiate God, he refuses to. But that leads him to a strange and existential question, which is, well, why on earth would God allow this to happen? Now, throughout the story, 3 of his friends show up and try to offer him temporarily some consoling experiences. But it doesn't last. Eventually, they start looking for a reason as to why Job is suffering. Obviously, he's done something wrong. Job holds to his guns and speaks the truth, because the God of Israel is ultimately a God of truth, even though Job is not a Jewish figure in the story, but it's written by Jews and for Jews. And so he says, I didn't do anything to deserve this. And so in their attempt to maintain their comfort and security about how the good are exalted and the evil suffer, well, Job says that narrative doesn't quite work. And sure enough, God vindicates him. Now God says to him from the whirlwind, were you there when I created the world or tamed Leviathan? And it's often interpreted as if God was saying to Job, What do you know? Know your place. Be silent. But my friend, one of my favorite thinkers, G.K. Chesterton, he wrote an article about this reflection on Job. And in that question, Chesterton maybe offers what I consider to be a slightly wiser interpretation, where God says to Job, you don't even know how bad it is. The cosmos is in worse shape than you think, and I am heartbroken over it. I have created it to be good, and yet it is falling apart at the seams. And you can feel God's heartbreak as you would understand the tragedy of an artist who, after trying to create a great magnum opus, all of a sudden has producers and other middling hands getting in the way of his work and warping it and twisting it, and yet he needs their participation. Just as God, to create his masterpiece, you and me and all of creation, needs our consent in order for it to come out and to show its true beauty. Because creation can't show its true beauty until freedom is there. And yet at every stage we oppose him. And so as Job weeps, and as we weep, God weeps. And the tragedy is that you can't now fix sickness and death with a mere act of power. If the real problem is our rebellion against God, only an act of trust can undo it. And so this is why it's so important for the Christian tradition that although God did not create death, God now has to redeem and conquer death, which is the whole point of the crucifixion and the resurrection. That God has to, in a sense, make good on the evil of humanity's contribution to the cosmos, and somehow integrate it into his own divine life. And so Jesus chooses his own obedience to the Father to be expressed by his willingness to suffer the fate of a slave, even death on a cross. And it is for that reason that God highly exalts him and lifts him at his own right hand. And so the reason why Christians understand that sin and death are not a result of God's action, but a result of human sin, is precisely because God created us for life and humanity rebelled. And now we like rebelling. And like a cancerous cell, the rebellion continues. But then this only leads us to a further question. Well, that's all well and good. That would be true, presuming, of course, that sickness and death began with humanity. But clearly, we have these things called fossils and such. Clearly, that's not the case. Now, at this point, we're going to enter entirely into the speculative, but this is where I'm going to have the most fun. Because if it is true, and it plainly is true, that there have been billions of years of history in the cosmos long before human beings came on the scene, then how does one account for the pre-existence of death before humanity? To answer that question, you need to kind of go almost in random with a number of different principles that do eventually converge into, in my estimation at least, a single understanding of how this answer would come about. First is to realize that time is not always measured in the same way. First of all, it's not just simply that time goes 1 second at a time, just as the camera in front of me here goes, so many seconds, so many minutes, etc., etc. It's more than just that, because you can not only experience time as unilinear movements going forward, But it also has a psychological component to it. And the psychological component you all know very, very well. How long it takes to sit in an ICBC line finally waiting to get to the front. And then, the suffering of that is made worse by the fact that you hate being there, and now you have to wait even longer, and so the pain is even worse. The same thing can happen in so many different dimensions of time, is that although we have a common measurement of time, it's not always the same thing. Now, in addition to that, moral time works differently than chronological time. You can see this when you've ever had to write a story or tell your own story. How often has an event in your present, recently experienced in your present, changed how you viewed your past? Now, I'm sure you and me have all been through this. As many of you know, I am an adult convert. I became Catholic in my 20s, and now I am a priest. Now that I know this part about myself, this priestly life that I'm in, then it has an impact on how I tell the story of my past. Now, this is important in Christian life because all of history leads to Christ, and Christ is the origin point of all history. That even though the dinosaurs come before Jesus, Jesus is prior to them in a different measurement of time. He is that focal point upon which all of creation hinges. Just in the same way, you can see in the smaller level, that one moment in your life when you met that spouse, or in my case, when you finally received a vocation to faith, then that transformation then has a significant impact on how the universe is seen and experienced. 1 point. Second point. Now, if you presume, for instance, that you do not buy all of that gobbledygook that I just said, well, it's important then to keep in mind that that passage from the Book of Wisdom that I had cited points that the devil himself is the author of death that comes from his envy or his hatred of God. Now, this is important because according to the traditions overall, we don't actually know, it's not like anybody was there, he rebelled against God at the dawn of creation, at its very beginning. Now, some of the best tellings of this happen in Milton or in other kinds of poetic license. But by and large, the tradition goes that Satan looked on creation with contempt and hatred. And the moment that he heard that it was God's intent to create human beings in his image and likeness, rebelled. Now, presuming that he would have done that at the beginning, at the declaration of the cosmos, then he would have also been at work at the very foundation of the universe until the present. And that maybe, and this is a mythology that C.S. Lewis kind of devises, and he explains a little bit as a likely tale in his book, The Problem of Pain, definitely worth reading, that maybe one of humanity's tasks was to set creation right as a mini Christ, if you will, that human beings were, through their mandate to domesticate and to have dominion over the creation, to be able to show a stewardship and a care on the ground that God wanted to mediate through us. Now, the sad thing is that then by the fall, then we joined his side. We joined the enemy side. And then not only did that result in a separation between us and God, but that also created division between ourselves, i.e. the man and the woman, and of course, all human beings by extension, but also now humanity's relationship with the universe as well. That this enmity, this discord that we were actually meant to heal, now we are making worse. That's a point worth thinking about. And I thank C.S. Lewis for bringing that up. Second point. Third point. The creation stories themselves don't follow straightforward narratives. Now, if you read the book of Genesis, chapter 1, God creates the world and begins by saying, let there be light. We all know the story. God created the blood, and then there was blah, and it was good. And it was good. It was really, really good. And then after he gets to, he made them in his image and likeness, male and female, he created them. And God looked in all that he made and saw that it was very good. Well, there's that story. Now, in the second story, in chapter 2, God starts by creating Adam in the garden. Then he creates the animals to be his partners. Then they realize that those animals are not suitable as a part. Then God creates his helpmate, his bride, his partner. And then that is that experience of the woman, his equal partner, that whom he can love. Then creation is complete. But you see that the narrative has a strange difference. And one is that it builds up towards the partnership between man and woman. And then in the second story, you have the man, but it's only until the woman is created that he himself is complete. And yet in between is all the other creative actions. So if one actually wanted to be a literalist and put those two stories together, good luck. It doesn't work. So you, in a sense, you'd have to either pick one, or you'd accept the fact that sometimes the story works in rather nuanced fashions. Point 3. Fourth point. Now this one is the hardest one to describe, but it coincides very much with the fact that God is an artist in creating the world. Now it's important to have the metaphor of an artist rather than as a craftsman, because an artist creates things that are not needed. A craftsman creates tools or products for use. When God created the world, there was nothing he needed. It's not like me needing a tool or a computer or a camera or a computer mouse. I need these things in order to do a job. God needs no things to get anything done. He can just do it. And so when he creates, he's creating as an artist creates, beautifully. Now, this is the important thing about an artist, is that at an early phase when they have the rough materials is just what it is. And so gradually, then the whole purpose is to bring out of potential what would be the actual in the art. Now, the tragedy of bad art is when the potential doesn't actually reach what it could have been. And you could see that this is a work in progress, but then at a certain point, the work in progress becomes stunted, or it reaches an end point that is tragically not what it could have been. Now, when it comes to the strange phenomenon of death prior to humanity, I do not want to say that the animals or anything like that did not suffer, or that entropy were not a problem. So presuming, maybe second point, that the devil did in fact work against God and his purposes, but the suffering still is very different than when a human being suffers. Because we have a knowledge of the pain that we are going through, which is vastly different. You can see it. You can see it in a deer about to die, or a human being about to die. Sometimes an animal just goes, well, that's it, I guess I'm done, and then just shuts off. The human being can't do that. And in fact, things that an animal also finds easy, we find a nightmare. Many of us do not sleep as well as a cat does, and we would like to. But it's precisely because of your dignity that you can't. Human beings, in a sense, are this strange kind of middle monster between a simple animal and something beyond. And that is that failed artmanship that I'm trying to describe. For an animal, the tragedy of death is not so much a tragedy, but just it is. It is what it is. And then very often when we even see the nature of individual personality in an animal, we're often projecting it. Now, I do not mean to doubt that animals do not have a certain affection for each other, but only at a certain level of the evolutionary ladder. For the most part, not. But then even then, we still read so much of ourselves into, Mr. Pibbles the cat. But the suffering that is bound in our human experience, I surmise, comes from the fact that we are so close to what we are meant to be, and we feel it. and yet it's not there. And it's precisely because of our proximate nature, how close we are to God, and yet so infinitely far, that the real tragedy becomes clear. And it's only after human beings are made does that become real. The failure of the cosmos becomes plainer in human beings. Now, I mentioned the failure of the art of the cosmos, and I hope some of you at the very least went, wait a second, God doesn't make mistakes. And I'd love to be able to say that that is absolutely true. But I provide it with this small caveat. If one wants to look at creation as a self-contained thing, then yes, it is a total failure. Because if God wanted to create a life that was protected from all trial, protected from all suffering, protected from every possible evil, then it could not be the masterpiece that he was planning. Because at the very beginning, it couldn't be free. By the very act of creating something to be beautiful like God, it also then has to have that dimension of freedom. It has to have that dimension of danger. Now, this is beautifully brought out in one of Dostoevsky's books called The Notes from Underground, because God had somehow, the book doesn't speculate on this directly, but God has somehow created us to be rebels. And why? And I suspect it's because that God created us to want more. But the sad thing about sickness and death, like cancer, is that we want more and more, but we're feeding on terrible food. We're running the bank dry. One of those strange things about human beings is that if we let our passions run, nothing in the universe could sate them. And this is the tragedy behind the glutton, the lustful, the proud, the arrogant, is that there's never enough for them. But if one has whet their appetites on the true and the living God, then those passions don't disappear. Christians are not meant to be without feeling, without passion, and without desire. God gave us all of these things, but to be fed on by him. And then, once he is our goal, then we are permitted to enjoy all of the other things in their proper balance. Because if we are not feeding on God, then we will feed on food, and we will feed to food in excess, beyond its proper usage. Just in the same way, when we trust in life in this world, it will inevitably turn on us. So the symbolism of suffering and death, sickness and death, points to the very nature of creation itself, that God has created us for something infinitely more. And that is why when you see a picture of a saint, and now, today, we are very blessed to be able to see firsthand pictures of living saints. They carry themselves in a very different way. Two saints in particular, when I see pictures of them, you see in them a beauty that goes well beyond this world. The two that I'm thinking of are the two Teresas, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux and Saint Teresa of Calcutta. Both of them have an attractiveness to them that does not provide an earthly analog. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, there are some pictures where she pierces into your soul, as if she's looking through you and in you at the same time. And Teresa of Calcutta, I don't think that there's a part in her face that is not a wrinkle. She seems to have every wrinkle covered, and yet she's one of the most beautiful women you can ever see. Why? Because she's living a life beyond death. She's living a love that can't be defeated by death. And this is why, as we get older or sick, it's a good time to reassess our heart and our idols. For what and for whom have we been living? It's great to love the things of this world. God created them to be lovable. But if we trust them entirely, we've missed the focal point of the painting, the plot of the play, and the beauty of the statuary. The statuary that one day will come to life, alive with the light of Christ and fed with his eternal food. That's the best I can do in this first episode of Peripheral Vision. Keep praying, stay faithful. God bless you.